Welcome back to The Explainer. So today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating case study about how a 2,000-year-old institution navigates modern, high-stakes geopolitics. We're looking at a seemingly contradictory approach by the Vatican that has honestly left a lot of seasoned observers scratching their heads. If you follow global religious diplomacy, you already know the Holy See relies heavily on centuries of precedent. But recently, well, their diplomatic choices look, at least at first glance, like a pretty massive double standard between two very different factions.
And that brings us to the central mystery we're unpacking today. Why on earth did the Pope formally excommunicate the conservative, traditionalist group known as the SSPX, while at the exact same time maintaining this incredibly delicate, ongoing dialogue with Chinese Catholics who operate under a communist-controlled state? It feels totally contradictory, right? I mean, on one hand, you've got a group fighting tooth and nail to preserve ancient traditions getting pushed out, and on the other, a group heavily managed by a secular state is kept at the table. To figure out why, we actually have to look past the surface-level politics and dig into the baseline rules of the Church itself.
To really understand the stakes here, we first need to define the absolute golden rule for the Catholic Church. It all boils down to a concept called communion with Rome. Specifically, bishops literally must be ordained by the Pope himself. If they aren't, they face automatic excommunication. And we're not just talking about a slap on the wrist here. It is a formal, complete severing from the Church. And as we'll see, this excommunication can even be extended to their entire community of followers. This is the ultimate red line.
Now, theologian Father Lorenzo Prezzi highlights a really stark contrast to help make sense of this. The Vatican is actually dealing with two entirely different types of conflict. With the SSPX, the conflict is purely doctrinal. They are actively rejecting core church teachings. But with China, the conflict is administrative. It's essentially about who controls the paperwork and the public life of the church, not about the theology itself.
Which brings us to our first section, the SSPX doctrinal divide.
Let's zoom in on this first faction to really grasp this divide, because, this isn't some new argument that just popped up overnight. It's a schism that's been brewing for decades. The fallout starts way back in the 1960s, rooted in their foundational objections to the Second Vatican Council's reforms. Fast forward to 2012, and Pope Benedict XVI actually offered the SSPX a way back in, basically a compromise where a conservative interpretation of the council could have prevailed. But they flat out rejected it. Today, under the vastly different directions of Pope Francis and now Pope Leo XIV, Catholic conservatives are much more isolated, and the SSPX finds itself firmly on the outside looking in.
The crucial takeaway here is that the SSPX didn't just bend a minor rule. They fundamentally challenged the Church's doctrine and the entire modernized direction it's taken over the last 60 years. They fiercely objected to the Second Vatican Council, they heavily opposed introducing the Mass in languages other than Latin, and they broadly resisted the Church's drive to open up to the wider global population, preferring instead to remain rigidly traditional. So in the eyes of Rome, they drew a major theological line in the sand, and then confidently stepped right over it.
And just to put their actual influence into perspective for a second, despite the immense amount of noise and heated debate this group generates within Catholic circles, the SSPX mostly consists of just a few 100,000 followers globally. So yeah, they punch way above their weight in terms of visibility, but ultimately, they are a very small minority within a truly massive global institution.
All right, let's pivot to Section 2, China, and what we're calling an administrative struggle. Because this paints a completely different picture. We are shifting from a dispute about ancient Latin texts to a very modern, very real struggle for survival. Unlike the SSPX, we are talking about massive scale here. There are somewhere between 10 to 20 million Chinese Catholics. That is a gigantic demographic for the Church. And when you're dealing with tens of millions of people, the pastoral calculus entirely changes. You aren't just managing an academic theological debate anymore, you're responsible for an entire generation of believers.
Now, the vital distinction to remember is that Chinese Catholics never officially challenged the Church's doctrine. They never rejected the Second Vatican Council. Instead, the friction exists entirely in the gray areas of control between the state and the Church. The state wants to manage civil rules, the Church wants to manage religious life. Think of it kind of like a massive bureaucratic zoning dispute rather than a fight over the fundamental laws of gravity. Doctrinally speaking, the Chinese Catholics are entirely on the same page as Rome.
But the history here is a perfect example of just how incredibly complex navigating that overlap can be. Under Pope Benedict XVI, several bishops were illicitly ordained in China without papal approval. We're talking about figures like Ma Yinglin and Liu Xinghong back in 2006.
By 2011, when Lei Shiyin and Huang Bingzhang were illicitly ordained, the result was automatic excommunication, a penalty the Church refers to as late sententia. But wait a second, if they broke that golden rule we established earlier, why wasn't the entire Chinese Catholic community excommunicated right alongside them, exactly like what happened with the SSPX?
Well, it all comes down to one word: intent. Rome firmly believed the Chinese ordinations happened under extreme duress. The state basically forced the issue. It wasn't born out of some willful, direct doctrinal defiance against the Pope. Compare that to the SSPX, who acted entirely out of their own volition, intentionally cementing a deliberate schism. The Chinese Catholics, despite having these illicit ordinations forced upon them, were desperately trying to maintain their bridge to Rome.
Which brings us to Section 3, the North Korean warning. To truly grasp why the Vatican made a highly pragmatic and, let's be honest, pretty controversial deal with China in 2018 to regularize these bishops, we have to look at a historical tragedy they are absolutely determined not to repeat. The Vatican has a very long institutional memory. Before 1950, in a North Korean population of about 7 million people, there was a vibrant community of roughly 50,000 Catholics. That was almost 1% of the entire population at the time. They were present, they were active, and they were in full communion with Rome. Now, if that original percentage had merely held steady with normal population growth, there should be about 150,000 Catholics in North Korea today. But today, zero. After 3 generations of being entirely torn away from Rome, with absolutely no communication allowed, that local church didn't just struggle. It transformed into something else entirely and then completely disappeared.
And that leads us to our final section, the strategic choice. This kind of total erasure is exactly what the Vatican is trying to prevent in China today. Their 2018 deal wasn't about endorsing state control at all. It was a pure strategic choice for survival. Let's look at the reality on the ground in China today as a result. Is it ideal? Absolutely not. Our sources note it is far from perfect on many, many levels. But consider this: 10 to 20 million people still remain in communion. Crucially, their bishops are now ordained by the Pope, maintaining that vital link. And their doctrine continues to follow Rome. They are not schismatic, they are not heretic, they're just simply trying to survive. Ultimately, the Vatican's whole strategy boils down to this singular, defining principle highlighted by the Appia Institute: better little communication than no communication. The Vatican realizes that severing ties over administrative disputes would likely result in the exact same slow, silent erasure we saw in North Korea. A frayed tether is infinitely better than a cut rope.
So as we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a truly profound question about the lengths an ancient institution must go to ensure its people aren't just lost to history. The SSPX chose strict doctrinal purity and ended up completely isolated. The Vatican chose an imperfect, messy compromise in China just to keep tens of millions of people connected to their faith. So, when facing the total disappearance of an entire community, is an imperfect compromise actually the most faithful choice you can make? It's a fascinating dilemma, for sure, and one that's definitely going to define the Church's legacy for the next century. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this today, and as always, keep seeking the deeper story.